So thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting, and also for the two prior speakers for kind of paving the way for my sort of comments on treatment guidelines for relapsing MS and the two-step approach for disease-modifying therapy. Here are my disclosures. So just to reiterate what the suggested two-step approach is for products with anticipated profound effect, etc. Products should be evaluated in comparative superiority study in patients with insufficient response to first-line treatment, and only if the safety profile is judged to be acceptable, efficacy studies may be extended to a broader MS population. Now, why challenge this approach? And I think this was one of the reasons why I've been invited, that I kind of raised my hand immediately after I read this draft. And one of the reasons is that because we already have one in the UK, and generally speaking, we don't like it. Sorry. Am I going backwards? Sorry for that. And so here's one of the key documents that is sort of operational or instructing neurologists in the UK about what to do with disease-modifying treatment. This is from a clinical commissioning board, and now it used to be NICE, so the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, that provides instructions that then are sort of passed down to the local commissioning groups, and that's now sort of a nationwide protocol, such that NICE provides guidelines, and then the CCGs essentially decide about what is going to be funded. The reason why I think there is a connect is that between sort of these guidelines and that two-step approach, it will become clearer during my talk, but it's fair to say at this point that what is being in the approval by the EMA is generally being sort of taken on board by NICE and often made a little bit more restrictive. So here's one example for fingolimod. So starting criteria: patients have an unchanged or increased relapse rate or ongoing severe relapses compared with previous year, despite treatment with beta interferon. So only under these circumstances can fingolimod be prescribed at the moment, and of course at a discounted price as part of the patient access scheme. So I want to move through this presentation by challenging this two-step approach on 4 grounds: on predicting disease course, the efficacy of disease-modifying treatment, side effects and safety, and cost. I'm sorry, this is a very sensitive... okay. Yeah, there you go. So, and I'll start by giving a glimpse of the second half of George Eber's talk, which he didn't have time this morning to provide, which is out of one of his publications, looking at the impact of relapses on disease progression. And sorry, my goodness, I'm trying to keep this sort of together. What this slide shows is that when you have 3 or more relapses in the first couple of years of a diagnosis, then your time to disease to DSS-6 is 15 years. Sorry, if you have 3 or more relapses, your time onset of progressive phase is significantly shorter than if you are sort of have fewer relapses. So a clear suggestion that relapses do impact on long-term disease outcome. even if that is not the case, there is, good evidence for changes very early on that can be measured in the gray matter here, the deep gray matter in the brain here, in this case using so-called voxel-based morphometry in 62 patients who have only had a clinically isolated syndrome, and yet compared to controls, there are significant changes in deep gray matter structures, the chordate nucleus, etc. Also evidence from Nicola Di Stefano's group and the Magnum's network showing that across the board there is brain atrophy in all disease courses. So from clinically isolated syndrome through relapsing, remitting, second progressive, and primary progressive MS. And if you interpolate that further, then you can even look at people with radiologically isolated syndrome who then move on to develop clinical MS, and the same picture emerges. Now, we don't, despite these sort of global measures, we don't actually know yet what that means in cellular terms, and this is part of the work that we've been doing in our lab, looking at the overall number of neurons lost in the brain. And as you can see here, in MS, you end up with about 30% fewer neurons across your whole brain than in controls. We also find changes early in the disease, and this has been alluded to by several speakers over the day, that cognitive decline can be detected early on. Now, this is in line with what my sort of predecessors here were already stating, the paradigm shift that has happened for some, and some perhaps still a bit reluctant about, but that early active treatment is so important for people with MS to prevent progression as much as possible. And the model for this is certainly adopted from rheumatology. So potent immunomodulatory agents for early treatment are desired and available now, rebooters versus reversible immunomodulators. And I think the good depiction of that, or the importance of early treatment, is captured here. This comparison between the use of alemtuzumab in later MS versus very early MS cases where EDSS, the EDSS status remained stable or, in fact, improved. So the concept is very much that if you treat a diagnosis, you will impact on the long-term outcome. If you start later, you may still improve the overall outcome, but not as well as if you treat at an early point. Here's another part of George's talk, which is a very hard outcome, which is death. So the time between randomization to the pivotal interferon beta-1b trial and death was, there's a significantly reduced hazard ratio for people who had been on treatment early, by between 46 and 50%, and the same is true here for the time between onset of the disease and death. And in I thought, deadpan statement, they concluded in this subsequent review that notwithstanding its long latency, mortality is therefore an unambiguously valid long-term outcome in randomized controlled trials. It usefully combines the net impact of treatment efficacy on longevity and adverse effects, which may reduce it. So this is about death. Okay, moving on to efficacy, and just a couple of examples of one drug that relatively recently made it through and one that didn't. The trial results at the time in terms of relapse rate very similar, as well as their impact on disability. What I want to make, or the point I want to make at this stage, however, is that these curves are not flat. So we're certainly not at the point where we can kind of assume disease modification in the early phase has been totally successful. And I'm sure my colleagues from Sanofi will forgive me showing this graph. I know the one with the cumulative data looks much better. But I thought the two-step approach takes an assumption that the DMTs currently available are sufficiently efficacious and safe such that no further drugs are needed in the early stages of relapsing MS. Now moving on straight to safety and adverse effects of the highly effective DMTs. We have here potentially fatal infections, gastrointestinal and flushing, also PML with fumodam, hair loss, liver toxicity, teratogenicity, and obviously the secondary autoimmunity with alemtuzumab. Having said that, most or all of these adverse effects are manageable. And I think it's important to also consider what patients actually think about taking a risk. And many of you will know this paper in the wake of the natalizumab development and registration. What risk patients are actually prepared to take. And here they've divided the groups into a slow progression benefit, clinically relevant benefit, and the largest tested benefit, which would equal to a number of relapses in the next 5 years reduced from 4 to 0. The time until the next disability progression increased from 1 year to 8 years. And in that case, people were actually pretty close in terms of the risk they were prepared to take, as if they were now in the high-risk group, JC virus positive over with a high titer. This is not to say that we shouldn't look into safety, but I think we should consider patients' views here. Another aspect that I find a bit is sort of underrepresented in looking at safety or adverse effects is the day-to-day adverse effects of injectable drugs. This is a paper, or from a paper looking at drug adherence. As you can see on interferon beta-1b, about 35 to 40% of patients actually discontinued within 2 years, and that sort of squares with earlier data. And why is that? Because they don't get rid of the flu-like symptoms, injection site reactions are relevant, and that's kind of what their day-to-day experience with the drug is, despite the drug's otherwise relatively safe in the long term. So unfortunately, these aspects don't feature very much in clinical commissioning. And as you can see here, natalizumab can be used in people with highly active disease who have been either on no previous disease-modifying drug or receiving beta interferon. However, what is being considered in the AAN guidelines, which is medication intolerance, aka side effects, adverse effects, etc., don't really feature there. Another example for fingolimod, I'd mentioned that before, patients only eligible if they are treatment failures on beta interferon, but no mention of the intolerable side effects that may prevent patients from further taking that drug, as here in this sort of paper by Hyland and Cohen which reflects, I think, the American or US position reasonably well. And also, I think, very important here, people who are seropositive for JC. Finally, cost, and I'm coming to an end. And here is, I think, maybe an area where I'm a little bit in the lion's den, quite obviously, because it relates to cost. This is an overview of the cost of MS in the UK. The total cost per year for a patient with MS is around about $48,000. You look at disease-modifying treatments. These are prices taken from the British National Formulary, including the one for fingolimod, so not with a drug access scheme included. Looking at the two-stage approach, and the point has been made earlier, this would add and delay the further development of drugs. Now, you or most of you will know much better what that means, because the net cost of developing a drug, I believe, for fingolimod was much higher than this figure down here on the right. Now, cost is obviously one aspect, and that's something that society or healthcare services have to take. But there's obviously also the other end of it, which is the business of MS, worth about, 14 billion in 2012 and predicted 23 billion in 2018. And I found that statement particularly sort of noteworthy, that there's currently no disruptive product in late-stage development, which a little bit sort of refers to our what we were discussing earlier about repurposing. So, to conclude, all current DMTs work best when used early in relapsing MS. New generation drugs are an improvement compared to current DMTs, and adverse effects are manageable, despite some of them having profound effect on the immune system and thus potential serious safety issues. Nevertheless, or precisely for that reason, the evidence is not in favor of a two-step approach for trials of new DMTs. New drugs should rather be tested in head-to-head studies or multi-arm designs. Not only severe and or long-term side effects should be considered, but also adverse effects with significant impact on the current life of people with relapsing MS. A two-step approach would delay development of new DMTs and lead to a further rise in cost. Whilst this may cause some problems for big pharma, it would certainly destroy attempts at repurposing of potentially effective and yet affordable drugs. I think following a personal remark, following the license now of alemtuzumab, I'd say that you should go back and look at a first license or first line license for fingolimod and natalizumab. Thank you.